Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the NDC Voices webinar in partnership with Perception Strategies. My name is Kelsey Hott, and I serve as AVP and Interim Head of Advancement at the National Diversity Council. This morning's topic is navigating DEI backlash, organizational and employee-centered strategies. We have a great discussion planned for you this morning, and we're so happy to have you all joining us. Before we dive into today's program, we wanted to take a few moments to point out our Zoom housekeeping items. First, the NDC has a legal disclaimer, which all of you have had an opportunity to read in our pre-event emails regarding the importance of not saving or sharing anything from today's segment, as well as ensuring that only approved individuals participate in today's session. We have the chat box enabled, so we invite you to join the conversation and introduce yourself there in the chat. When you submit a chat, please make sure that you indicate everyone to be heard and seen. Please be mindful and refrain from messaging our panelists privately as they present. If you think of any questions for our speakers throughout today's program, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will enter into a short Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we'll review the questions found there in the Q&A box. I have my NDC team member, Anjali Brown, joining me today. Hi, Anjali. They will write a note into the chat now. You can reach out to me or Anjali privately if you need any assistance or have any technical issues during today's segment. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator to kick off today's program, NDC CEO Anika Raman. Without further ado, Anika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Thank you, Anjali, and welcome everyone. We've had tremendous demand for this webinar, and we know that the topic is so timely. So thank you so much to all of the attendees and, of course, to our panelists. I'd like to introduce our three panelists who will be sharing their knowledge and insights with you this morning. And of course, they are terrific. So I'm going to invite each one of them to present a little bit about themselves. Just so you all know, you can find their full professional bio on our website and linked in that chat box. So I'd like to pass it over to each of our panelists to say a little bit about themselves, a fun fact, and then we're going to proceed. Thank you. Jason, would you like to start?
Happy to. It's so good to be here, and thanks so much for having me. My name is Jason Craig Harris. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the managing partner of Perception Strategies. And I feel so good to connect and to engage today. A fun fact is that we here where I am in Brooklyn, New York, are really leaning into autumn. And so I am in pumpkin season, and I love all things pumpkin: pumpkin cake, pumpkin bread, pumpkin pie, pumpkin lattes. And so I'm looking forward to soaking it in as much as possible. Thanks so much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Rather. I'm the General Counsel for the American College of Chest Physicians, which is a medical association in Chicago for pulmonologists, critical care, and sleep medicine doctors. I'm actually based in Madison, Wisconsin. My fun fact is that I'll go seasonal as well, Jason, but a little different. I'm one of those rare people that's actually excited because it's almost winter. I'm a big skier, cross-country and downhill skier, so we're coming into my favorite time of year despite everyone else wanting to hibernate. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cecilia Orellana Rojas, and I'm Senior Vice President of Strategy and Research at the National Diversity Council. I'm located in San Antonio, Texas, so it's going to be about 76 degrees today here. That is a fun fact for sure. But in addition, I wanted to also share a fun fact about myself. I was born at home in my home country, Chile. That at the time when I was born, there was a huge earthquake. So all of the hospitals had, basically falling, and my mom had to have me at home. So we had the doctors coming into the house. So that's just a fun fact about myself. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, each of you. As you all can see, we have an extraordinary panel here today to discuss these important topics. Each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes about their topic and question, and then we will open up the floor to the other panelists so that we can have a discussion about the question raised. As a reminder, Please be sure to be engaged in social media, hashtag NDC Voices. We also invite each attendee to join the conversation by submitting your questions in the Q&A box located, I'm told, as we all know, in your Zoom toolbar throughout the program. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first topic and first question really is for John. What does the SCOTUS Supreme Court decision ruling on affirmative action and recent state level anti-DEI legislation mean for our DEI work? What do employers need to know about the rulings and their potential impact on the workplace? John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks again. The answer is it's not good, but we'll put more behind that. First, let me give you a disclaimer just because I'm a lawyer and I love disclaimers. I'm going to provide you my thoughts on what I think the implications are and the landscape out there. I'm not providing legal advice. Obviously, I can't do so, and please don't rely upon what I say as the law or what you should do. You get what you pay for, I guess you could say. I'm also going to give you my personal opinions, not the official position of my employer, the American College of Chest Physicians. So with that in mind, we know that these efforts that we're talking about aren't new, right? But what we also know is that the Supreme Court's decision in June turbocharged them. It gave license to those who were already challenging these efforts and encouraged them to continue and strengthen their efforts. Unfortunately, the answer to a lot of the what does this mean is kind of a big fat shrug emoji. We're in an area where we've hit a reset from a legal perspective, and therefore it's hard to know to a certain extent how things are going to shake out, and that's unsettling. It's also hard for organizations to base their efforts around, and it requires a bit more courage and examination of what your risk tolerances are, and we'll talk about that. That said, it's important to understand what the decision says and it doesn't say. Truth is power, and how it fits into the larger context. So we'll start by talking about the decision itself, which came out in June, a 6-3 decision. And its central holding is that using race as a factor in college admission decisions violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Which applies to any institution taking federal money, which is how they get to private colleges. Now, unless you're a college admission agent, you could say, what's the big deal, right? This doesn't apply to the rest of us. Really, the reason it's a big deal to the rest of us is because the Supreme Court decision directly attacked the basis upon which race-conscious programs have been founded. If you think about the fact that we spent the last 2 centuries enacting laws, constitutional amendments, fighting civil rights movements and court cases to establish that you shouldn't be able to discriminate against someone based on race or another protected class. And private companies shouldn't be able to deny services. And companies shouldn't be able to decide they only want to do business with other businesses that are owned by, white men or things like that. We got that established in the law. And when I say we, it was people before us that did a lot more work than anybody that looks like me did. But affirmative action programs and other race-conscious programs are, if we're honest about it, they are discriminatory. They are discriminating. They're making a choice, or at least a preference, based on an otherwise protected class under the law. So anything that is race-based or examines a protected class under the law has to meet what's called strict scrutiny if examined by a court. And that means that you can only have such a program if there's a compelling government interest in the purposes of it, and if it's narrowly tailored to accomplishing those means. It's the highest bar we set in looking at these types of issues. Now, the Supreme Court had previously identified that affirmative action programs and other race-conscious programs could meet that, could pass that bar. There was a series of court cases, first one called Bakke in 1978, and then Gutter in 2003, Gutter applying to Michigan Law School, that said that race could be considered as a plus factor, and it recognized that there is a compelling interest in diversity in higher education, in that diversity of perspectives and how it adds to academic discourse, which furthers our society as a whole. And it also found justification in writing centuries of systemic racism, that has to be reduced. I think eliminating is high hopes. As part of this, it was basically the Supreme Court's way of differentiating DEI racial discrimination from Jim Crow racial discrimination. The problem is the Supreme Court's decision this past June in the Students for Fair Admission case ripped that apart. It said that rationale doesn't stand up anymore. It preyed upon one line in the Gutter decision from 2003 that Justice O'Connor had said, we think that this is only justified for a while, and we think 25 years. I'm not sure why 25 years, but they said in 25 years, we don't think this will be necessary anymore. So in the Students for Fair Admission case, Justice Roberts said, well, it's been 20 years, mission accomplished, let's hit the showers. We've achieved these aims. We don't need to have these justifications anymore for race-conscious programs. We know that's a very naive interpretation of the law as well as what's transpired since 2003. But the problem is the Supreme Court has now basically removed those compelling government interests. And without that, you're back to core equal protection law, which basically says you can't discriminate or favor based on race or other protected classes. That has ramifications far beyond just college admissions, right? Now we're putting into doubt basically the core of DEI efforts. One thing I'll say is that decision did not touch on service academies like the Naval Academy, the Army Academy. It actually excluded them out. What happens there is going to be an interesting revelation, because it was suggested that there might be other types of compelling government interests in your military reflecting society and leadership and things like that, that could reestablish some things potentially. We know that that's going to be something that'll be forthcoming out of this. What's left though is a lot of confusion, right? Things that we thought we could do, things that we were basing our advancement efforts on, now we don't know. And it's given license to lawyers or risk managers to suggest that maybe you need to pull back on your efforts. And that's the last thing we want to hear, is the flywheel's just starting to spin on trying to undo some of the centuries of exclusion that we face in this society. So with that context, let's take a look at some of the various contexts at play and how this might shake out. In education, we know that you can't use it as race as a factor in admissions. That's the core holding of the Supreme Court's decision. What we don't know is what it means for financial aid, scholarships, professorships, academic freedom, things like that. You have some there saying, this is just about admissions. Everything else is status quo. And we have others that think that's a little naive. There's more at play here. There's an example. There was an Arkansas State Health Authority that had a minority scholarship program for medical students, and it was challenged by the same group that led the Supreme Court case from this past June. They ended up shuttering their program entirely, which is the worst thing that you want to see come out of this. Different organizations are responding very differently to this, because we are essentially in the Wild West when it comes to what the legal status of these things are. One of the big issues in education, though, is state legislation. You have states like Texas and Florida that have put limitations on what public schools and universities can do for DEI programs. They have their so-called anti-woke agendas. They even control certain words you can say, or in the classroom, certain books you can have. So they say states are the test bed for democracy, and unfortunately we're seeing that in not necessarily the most positive way right now. Employment is one of the big ones, obviously. Now, in employment, you can't consider race in employment decisions, whether it be hiring, promotion, firing, things like that. That was already the case. That's one of the core parts of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So to a certain extent, the Supreme Court's decision didn't affect that. Now, it does have some other potential ramifications, though. What does it mean for affirmative action programs, right? Voluntary affirmative action programs, or sometimes federal contractors are expected to have affirmative action programs. Previously, if you did a self-analysis and you showed that you had a significant disparity between your workforce and the greater society, you could impose race-conscious employment practices. You couldn't do it based on a quota, but it could be along the lines of plus factors or seeking diverse pools, things like that. Has that been thrown into doubt? We don't know. We're waiting for more guidance from the federal government. We're waiting to see how some of these things shake out. One thing I would say is, in the meantime, stressing or focusing efforts on seeking diverse applicant pools is a safe haven for some of these efforts. Even if you can't say we are going to assign plus factors based on race or other protected classes, you can choose where you recruit. For example, historically Black colleges, or in certain communities or through certain organizations that you can help partner with. So this isn't to say that you can't do anything in these areas. It's just knowing what is more certain, what has more risk associated with it. There's more guidance coming out from the Biden administration on some of these things and how to move forward. Keep your eyes out for those. But the one thing I'll say is also be cautious of them, because like everything else nowadays, this is political. And so the administration has every desire to show that DEI work can continue, and we want to provide a guide path for organizations to do so. The problem is that's not tested in court. So we don't know how that'll shake out. The big one for me, just very quickly, is training programs and support programs, whether that be scholarships. We're standing up a fellowship right now with another organization for medical trainees in underrepresented communities. We don't know how that's going to play out. There was 3 different law firms that were sued by Edward Blum, who led the Supreme Court case. And all 3 of them, large, prominent law firms, originally said, we're going to defend these. We know what we're doing is right. We're law firms. We're going to defend these in court. All 3 of them have since changed the criteria for their programs and gone to more race-neutral criteria. That concerns me. Frankly, if deep-pocketed law firms who have the legal resources to fight these types of things aren't willing to and changed course, that doesn't tell us what's legal or illegal, but I was counting on them, quite frankly, to be the test cases and to fight the fight. And the fact that they're not has me nervous, I will say. We need some test cases. We need some of these things to shake out in lower courts so we have some guidance to depend on. In the meantime, it's really a question of your risk tolerances. What is your organization willing to do? You could say, we'll wait until we're sued, and if we're sued, then we'll deal with it. Bring it on. You could say, we've got too much important work. We're not willing to put up with this crap. We've got to go to a more race-neutral type program. We also know, and I know Jason and Cecilia will talk more about, there are other strategies. What's happening in the court doesn't mean that these things have to grind to a halt, but it's examining what we think is reasonable and can be done. The other thing I'll say is there's a cost to not pursuing DEI, right? Beyond the obvious if it's the right thing to do. We know that DEI efforts produce more engaged workforces. They can reduce harassment claims. They lead to more productivity. They're also mission-based, right? In our organization, we believe that leadership reflecting society will allow for more physicians that reflect society, which means physicians reflect their patients, which means a better patient-physician relationship, which means better health outcomes. So for us, DEI leadership is directly related to our mission, and we can't ignore that. We can't just say, we're not going to do this anymore. So that was a lot in a little bit of time, but I'd love to further the conversation, questions, hearing from Cecilia and Jason. This is an important area that needs a lot of discussion.
Thank you so much, John, for that thoughtful response. I know there's a lot more that we want to say, but I'd like to ask Cecilia first, and then Jason to give some feedback, questions, comments.
Yes, the interesting thing about all of this is that from my perspective, we see that history repeats itself, right? The University of Michigan and the UC system faced a similar ruling which banned the use of affirmative action in 2006 and 1996, respectively. And as a response to the sharp decline in diversity on their campuses, both institutions introduced a range of tactics that are aimed at recovering, the reductions they experienced in the racial population, student population. So, what we see is that by collaborating with these universities or implementing, their strategies, universities can maintain diversity efforts despite, the lack of affirmative action. We also have seen that in June, I think it was in June, there was a statement from the chair of the EEOC that tried to reassure employers. And what she said is that, it remains lawful for employers to implement diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs that seek to ensure workers of all backgrounds are afforded equal opportunity in the workplace, to also echo what John was saying. And we've seen that companies such as Salesforce or Google, Microsoft, and other Fortune 500 companies have publicly stated that they will continue to invest in DEI initiatives within their organizations. So throughout our research at the National Diversity Council, the overall advice for corporations worried about future litigation is to proceed with DEI initiatives, but proceed with caution, as John stated. And through the Supreme Court ruling, I should say, though the Supreme Court ruling does not directly, affect the corporate sector at this point, litigation against DEI policies is inevitable, right? That's what we've seen in the research. For that reason, strategic planning will better prepare the field to mitigate the effects of these lawsuits. I pass it on to Jason.
Thanks so much, Cecilia, and thank you, John, as well, for your thoughtful comments. I mean, the one thing that I can offer to sort of be additive to the conversation is to say that, I do think that there has been an overly narrow focus on demographic criteria with respect to hiring with diversity in mind. And that's always been a problem, right? So when we think about we need to diversify the employee population, the overemphasis on demographic characteristics alone can certainly lead to, more, of course, than simply what we're talking about in terms of, legal vulnerabilities, but it also can lead to forms of tokenism that I think is actually quite concerning. And so one of the things that we recommend at Perception is that, folks think about hiring a bit more broadly, right? We're not only thinking about demographic diversity, we should also be thinking about refocusing on what are the skills and lived experiences and competencies that we want to see in employees to forward inclusive leadership. Right? I mean, there are people in the world who have been working for years by virtue of their lived experiences, by virtue of intentional skills cultivation and competency cultivation, have been working for a long time to cultivate a disposition that is not hostile to, but welcomes diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Folks who are working on empathic listening, people who are working on cross-cultural communication skills. Those are skills that we need in our environments, right? That's what's going to help to build an inclusive environment for all. And so I want to just, go on the record and say that, we can hire, more people of color, and we should. And there are people of color in the world who are not actually invested or skilled in the work of cross-cultural competency, right? We can hire, and we should, white folks in the community, right? But there are a number of white folks in the community who are not invested in cross-cultural competency and diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think we need to really be thinking about the criteria that we're using. And I think we need to do some more work on building in skills, a rubric for skills, lived experiences, and competencies that already forward our aims around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Jason, that's a great point. It's a lot of times what lowers your risk is also just what's a good idea and the right thing to do in general. I love when those things dovetail. And I think this is one of those exact areas. Diversity is not meant to be exclusionary. And one of the biggest things coming out of the legal landscape is that exclusion can lead to risk as well. So, a small example, if you're going to have an ERG, for example, and let's say it's for women of color in leadership, that can be the focus, but why exclude others that might want to champion or be allies of that effort? I think that the more, like you said, that we focus on lived experiences and competencies and an interest in inclusion, and allow others to make their case for why they think they meet those, instead of saying it is purely demographic based. I think that's both legally sound, and I think it's a good idea in general. I absolutely agree.
I'd like to just comment on that and really pick up on Jason's point. We at National Diversity Council take an intersectional approach to all of diversity. It's not purely demographic, because we're talking about, disability inclusion, veteran inclusion. We're talking about neurodiversity. There's so many forms, and we're looking also, as you said, Jason, there are so many forms of lived experience that add to the diversity equation. I want to remind everybody that the Supreme Court decision was focused on race. And there is a tremendous, we in the DEI community and all of us take on a lot of intersectional forms of diversity, and we're talking about inclusion also. So I totally agree with you, Jason. So I think we should put the Supreme Court decision in context. That is really, really important, and continue, and we will in this conversation continue to talk about how we can double down on this. I also want to remind everybody that even in higher ed, there are ways to address the SCOTUS decision and still maintain the kind of diversity that we're all seeking. In fact, that is the focus of our next webinar in December, led by Professor Al Tillery, who is at the Northwestern University and head of the Center for Diversity and Democracy. He will talk about how to advance diversity, including racial diversity in higher education, within the parameters of what was stated by the Supreme Court, because there are ways in which, again, as you said, Jason, how to think about diversity broadly and to have criteria that will ensure that we get the kinds of students and people that we want in the workplace and in higher ed. I think that's really important. I know we're on time, so I'd like to pretty much move on to another really important topic, and that is, what are the sources of DEI backlash in your view? And this is directed at you, Jason. What is the impact of this backlash on employees and organizations? What advice can you give to leaders and managers for challenging conversations around an organization's DEI commitments? Over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much for that question. So I'm going to offer just some humble offerings, as I often say, but this is just sort of how I think about this. When I think about the sources of DEI backlash, I think about five things. Number one is apathy, right? There is this kind of general lack of long-term commitment that we see in various kinds of social movements for issues that don't seemingly directly impact us, right? So apathy is certainly one of the elements. We see that often following some huge reckoning that happens on the social scene, on the social landscape. So number one is apathy. Number two is fear. Right? There is a framing and an experience of DEI work as a threat to the status, power, and access that people in majority groups have enjoyed. Right. And so there is this fear that's associated with that loss of status, power, and access. And that's partly exacerbated by some real demographic shifts in the country. Right. We understand the United States is becoming increasingly racially and culturally diverse. And for some people, that is threatening. Right. And I think that part of it is that as we've been talking about DEI, many people are hearing us talk about folks who are historically marginalized. By the way, I like to reframe historically marginalized people as aspirationally included people. Aspirationally included people, a little less on the deficit disparity framing. So, the centering of aspirationally included people oftentimes means for some that it's decentering others. And so that stokes fear. The third category, right, apathy, fear, the third one is shame, right? When people learn about, their complicity in other people's suffering, or when they learn about the harm that they have inadvertently or maybe even intentionally caused, it can create the context of shame. And they can feel themselves so deeply implicated in the harm that they want to distance themselves from it. And because they don't have the skills to metabolize their own shame, they don't know how to alchemize their shame and turn it into something productive, moving from shame to responsibility. They don't have those skills. As a result, there's the backlash against DEI work, right? If it makes me feel badly and I don't have the skills to metabolize that, I'd rather discredit the movement than discredit myself. And so that's part of the issue that we're seeing here, shame. The fourth category is disidentification, right? Sometimes constructions of DEI can be overly narrow or can at least appear that way. And so there are people groups in the United States who don't see themselves reflected when we talk about DEI. And that's often because what they see when we talk about DEI is DEI means race, means Black and brown people. Right. And so there are people groups who don't fit into those categories who say, look, where am I in that? And so from the very beginning, it already seemed to them that DEI was an illegitimate enterprise. I'm particularly thinking about those for whom anti-Semitism is a real issue. Right? Often DEI programs don't identify or talk about anti-Semitism, or for that matter, anti-Arab sentiment, Islamophobia, xenophobia. Those are not always issues that we tackle. Now, some communities have, like you said, Anika, an intersectional approach, but not all communities do. And so if you don't see yourself reflected in it, it's really hard to forward the aims of it. So that's disidentification. The last category is ignorance, right? And that's ignorance of the ultimate aims of DEI work. And in my view, that's about a misperception that the goal of DEI work is to reverse hierarchies rather than abolish them. Okay. And people are ignorant. We know that, right? Human beings can, we have an incredible capacity for ignorance. But it's also true, and here I'm going to be honest, as a DEI practitioner, it's also true that people in my field have not always done enough to counter that ignorance. Sometimes we ourselves have been complicit in putting forward a limited view on the aims of DEI work as though it's only about improving the lives of Black and brown people. And so that's a problem, right? That's something that we have to address. In my view, that framing of DEI work is too narrow. And so we need to think about how we expand the frame and, importantly, how we expand how we talk about the frame. So in my view, the ultimate aim of DEI is actually universal. Right? It's about improving the lives of all employees and therefore identifying behaviors and practices that diminish two things, y'all. Number one is flourishing for all, and B, restricted flourishing. Right? That's unfairly restricted by race, gender, ability, sexual orientation. Right? As a former chief DI officer, my view was I'm trying to improve the climate and culture for everyone. And as a result of that, I'm taking notice of those places within the organization where there is what I call restricted flourishing. Again, flourishing restricted by race, gender, ability, or sexual orientation, et cetera. So when that happens, right, when there is restricted flourishing, we have to talk about targeted approaches to address it. Right. And John Powell frames this up as targeted universalism. We have a universal goal for everyone, but we adopt particular approaches to address when not everyone is experiencing the benefits of that universal approach. So the goal is human dignity. That's the goal. We want to protect it and assert it. The cause of DI is not about special rights. Unfortunately, the impact of the backlash, right, for those 5 reasons I mentioned earlier, is that some organizations appear to be frozen in their ability to have courageous conversations. Some are shying away from them. Some have very limited risk tolerances, to John's earlier point, right? Some have an inability to talk about race specifically. There's lots of fear of offending people in majority groups. And aspirationally included employees may be seeing what little progress they have made actually roll back. For example, in hiring a wider variety of people, in sustaining institution-wide conversations, and creating a culture hostile to dignity violations. By the way, I like the language of dignity violations as opposed to microaggressions, y'all. It's really helpful framing. Aspirationally included employees may feel alone or exhausted, demotivated, and even demoralized. And so, as we've seen, some DEI practitioner roles within institutions are also disappearing. And so aspirationally included folks may feel like they have no safe haven within their institutions, no one in positions of leadership and influence who can take up their cause to experience human dignity and flourishing. And so if I have to end with a couple minutes of advice for leaders and managers for challenging conversations around an org's DEI commitment, well, I would say that the conversation has to be refocused on human well-being, human flourishing, human dignity, and belonging. That's what we are after, y'all. Those are the goals. We're not after special rights, right? We're not after, siloing or siloed efforts. We are after human well-being, human flourishing, human dignity, and belonging. So we need to reframe our efforts and conversations around those core concepts and aspirations as our North Star. That's what we're after. So all of our institutional organizational efforts should ladder up to those goals and efforts. And any ones that don't need to be reconstructed or let go and new efforts pursued. I think we need to proactively communicate to all employees that these are our aims: flourishing, well-being, dignity, belonging, and we are redoubling our commitment to them. We need to communicate how these values actually benefit all employees. And if challenged, we need to share that these principles are woven into our institutional values. And watch this, y'all, they are simply a part of who we are as an institution. That's it. So when you challenge those principles, you actually challenge the constitutive elements of who we are as an institution. We are about well-being, dignity, flourishing, and belonging, right? It's not an add-on to our organizational life or work. It is constitutive of who we are. So therefore, if it is a part of who we are, that means that safeguarding dignity, well-being, belonging, flourishing is the job of every employee and leader. It's not an add-on to their job. It is a part of their job. And we must stake our claims on that. Finally, we got to think about narrative agency and narrative control. We should be lifting up employee testimonials about how they are being positively impacted by our work around well-being, flourishing, dignity, and belonging, around our DEI-centered work. Rather than the deficit framing and the disparity framing, let's use an asset-based framing and lift up stories about things going well, about employees like, yay, we're so excited for this conversation. I went to this ERG and it changed my life, and it enabled me to reconnect to the institution. If we frame things more positively in that way, we can drown out the noise, and that's the goal.
Thank you, Jason. So much, so on time. So I'd like to invite John, Cecilia to comment on some of the thoughts. Wonderful rephrasing. Jason loved the term dignity violations. Really, that's a new way and an affirmative way of thinking about, what we used to call, would still call, microaggressions. Love the focus on human well-being, dignity, belonging as a way to bring people together. So Cecilia, John, floor is open to each one of you.
Thank you, Jason, for that. And as Jason pointed out, most resistance to DEI is fear-based, right? And the best way to approach resistance is with inclusion, right? Is really engaging employees and team members by explaining that DEI focuses on our differences, but also on the values we share as human beings, like Jason was explaining. And that is really about fairness and respect, right? Those are our common values as human beings, and that benefits everyone in the organization. So that is the framework that Jason was explaining, and completely agree with that. And I also wanted to add some of the other ways in which DEI backlash can impact organizations in addition to decreased morale, like you said, Jason. There's also reduced productivity, right? That conflict and the resistance can divert time and energy away from productive work, and that hinders overall organizational performance. We could also have talent attrition, where we have employees that may leave organizations that do not address DEI concerns, resulting in talent attrition and high recruitment costs. So that's also an impact to the bottom line. In addition, we have also reputation damage, which is really important. DEI backlash can harm an organization's reputation, and that can affect relationships with customers, your relationship with partners and investors also. And finally, you have missed opportunities, right? Organizations may miss the benefits of diversity, such as increased innovation, creativity, and access to diverse markets.
Yeah, I want to echo what both of you said about fear being a large component about this, obviously. If you think about the efforts in challenging some of these programs, the conservative activism going on, it's not about actually them getting money back or putting people into bankruptcy. It's about causing enough fear, right? The number of lawsuits filed is not extremely high. the chances that the American College of Chest Physicians is going to be their next target is not extremely high. But yet we're out here talking about it. We're afraid. And so it's having its impact, right? It's making us second guess ourselves about what we know is the right thing to do. That's why it's that much more important right now to be vocal about commitment, both in terms of recruiting and with your internal and external constituencies. People want to know that we're not derailed from this. It's also important to have an active and creative DEI program and DEI staff. I mean, we're blessed to have Dr. Elizabeth Steigler in charge of our program here at Chest. And I would say that what's happening right now makes her role that much more important. It makes the creativity that people like Dr. Steigler bring that much more critical to our efforts, because we've had some tools taken out of our toolbox potentially, and we need more tools. And it's people like you all that are going to help us get there. So it's important, as Jason said, to recognize that fear and then find the ways to prevent it from paralyzing these efforts.
Yes, I mean, I guess I also am seeing that in this backlash mode, you're actually distinguishing and seeing the DEI champions move ahead and those who are deeply committed from those who were just doing it just for PR or the superficial level. I am seeing that. I'm having stakeholders come to us, those champions, and really dig deeper into DEI, like partners who are coming to us for more DEI work, more training, more support, and more employee engagement. And I find that fascinating. At the same time, others who are really talking in terms of risk, bringing in their lawyers, and those who were doing DEI, I would say, more superficially. So it's an interesting point of convergence or divergence here. And that's something we want to note, because not everybody is stepping back from DEI. I can assure you of that fact, just based on our relationships. The second point I want to make is something that is, of course, it is all fear-based, right? And those who are opposed to DEI want to make it unidimensional, like we were saying from the beginning of this conversation. They want to make it just about race. But really, this is about all human beings and all of us. And I find that when one starts to talk about intersectionality, when one talks about women, LGBTQI, disability, and veterans, you have a different way of framing the conversation and gets people listening. And I think especially with COVID and the rise of mental health issues, which are again part of the disability conversation, people lean into it a lot more, and it is the reality. We're not doing this because we're just trying to make DEI more palatable, but really, truly, because on the disability spectrum, we have so many more issues to contend with. And when you take that intersectional approach and that inclusive approach, Jason, you can see how this impacts pretty much everybody in the workplace. Jason.
I really appreciate your comments. And one thing I would just say is I agree that there's a lot of fear here. Absolutely. I do want to say that I think that some of this is not just fear, but shame. And when people don't have the skills to metabolize their own shame, they will either internalize that shame or they will externalize it and blow it through the bodies of others. And so I'm going to put into the chat a little link. Hopefully it will come up, but it is the compass of shame that helps to frame up this idea of when you feel like your social self is about to be threatened. If your greatest fear is that someone's going to brand you a racist or someone's going to brand you a bigot, and you are trying to avoid that and you don't want that, or you're ashamed because you realize that maybe you were complicit in harm, or maybe people who look like you were complicit in harm, it can activate the shame impulse, since we all want to be seen as good people. And if we can't metabolize our shame, we'll engage in various kinds of behaviors meant to mitigate the impact of the shame. We'll end up often, right, internalizing it or externalizing it and pushing it back on other people, right? So that includes behaviors like attacking others, right? Turning the table. Actually, this is your fault. Blaming others, avoiding the conversation altogether. You know, I know there's a DEI meeting happening and for all employees, but magically somehow I'm sick and I can't attend, or I got called into a meeting and I can't be there for the DEI meeting, right? Or withdrawal, right? Various ways of showing up physically, but mentally not being present. right? All of those are strategies for mitigating shame when there's actually more productive ways to do that. But again, folks have not been taught the skills to metabolize their own shame. So I don't want to underestimate the extent to which shame is actually factored in some of that backlash responses.
I also wanted to add, in terms of the importance of intersectionality in this discussion, right? From the point of view of the identities, the individual and group identities that we bring into the workplace, we also need to think about intersectionality in the way that we approach DEI work. So as leaders in the D&I space and as practitioners in the D&I space, we need to really do our work from an intersectional lens. We need to really look at this with a mindset and a language for examining the interconnections, the interdependencies between systems in organizations, and always looking at it from a perspective of, is there inclusion here or is there exclusion in terms of our policies, our systems, our processes, but also how different functions connect and interact with each other within a business to support D&I efforts, to collaborate and influence each other when it comes to D&I work. So I think it's really important for D&I leaders and D&I practitioners to continue the work from an intersectional perspective within their organizations.
Thank you, everyone. We're now going to move on to another theme that's part of the conversation here today. And this is for Cecilia to take the lead on what are some strategies to overcome organizational resistance to DEI and regaining DEI commitment. How can we continue to build on DEI strategies once we reestablish this commitment? Cecilia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Anika, and my fellow panelists. This is a great conversation, and thank you for the insights on these very important topics. So at the National Diversity Council, we believe that organizational focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion is more important than ever. And we've said that, and we're talking about that today. And the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action and the recent anti-DEI legislation at the state level, despite their impact on the workplace, should not stop concerted efforts to increase inclusion. So research shows, now let's talk about what we have in terms of research. Research shows that DEI, and we all know this, helps shape a healthier culture with enhanced collaboration, productivity, innovation, greater opportunities for all. We know that, right, based on the research. And this is exactly where DEI leaders and practitioners should start to overcome organizational resistance to DEI. We should be intentional about making the case that DEI offers better outcomes for both organizations and employees. Let me just tell you, a report from McKinsey published during the COVID-19 pandemic provided ample evidence that diverse and inclusive companies are likely to make better and bolder decisions. The report concluded that such companies outperform others by 36% during the pandemic. Just think about that. More prosperous organizations can offer better job security, right? Higher wages and advancement opportunities to their employees. So to build on DEI strategies, organizations must continue to pursue DEI initiatives and goals. However, they need to be more strategic, right? Organizations must be more intentional, as I mentioned earlier, with their DEI strategy. Employers must expressly communicate, reinforce their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They must also ensure that their DEI initiatives sustain a diverse talent pipeline, including re-examining their recruitment strategy in target areas. What else can they do? Organizations may consider, for instance, readjusting the language surrounding DEI efforts, especially in the context of higher education. There's, oppositions and opposite ideas about this, but this is one of, the ideas that is out there to address concerns, with impending litigation. They may come from anti-DEI interest due to race conscious programs. renaming titles and initiatives may avoid any potential violations, right? For example, renaming a position from DEI lead to head of multicultural affairs, right? That would be in the case of higher education. Additionally, regularly using words like inclusion, belonging, engagement to reinforce that the goal, again, is focused on improving organizational culture, not necessarily racial diversity. So it's making it broad, like we've been talking about. Another idea is to reframing your DEI strategy by placing organizational goals and outcomes at the forefront. So in the current environment, there is an opportunity to recommit. So the word is recommit to DEI initiatives, right? As inclusive efforts, and that, because they may likely be the next target, right? It is well known that companies that embrace diversity in their workforce yield a better bottom line and higher profits. That is the business case. And by creating a strong business case that confirms this financial importance of DEI initiatives, DEI leaders and practitioners can gain additional buy-in from those who may have misconceptions, right, or reluctance around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can also go beyond focusing solely on DEI training, for instance, or employee resource groups, diversity councils, etc. These are considered best practices, to be clear, and they support a DEI strategy. However, it is fairly common for DEI leaders and practitioners to stop pursuing further measures that help them take DEI efforts to the next level. So we discussed this in our NDC certification program, right? And emphasize the importance of approaching DEI work from a systems framework. So this means going beyond, the individual, the group level, to also focus on inclusive practices, on policies, climates within the organization, and also within our communities, going to the external sphere as well. A concerted effort on measuring all DEI efforts is also a must in the current environment to ensure stakeholder buy-in and sustainability. So continue to measure and be strong on that particular end. Organizations, as I said, must be intentional in measuring their efforts to show the return on the investment of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's interesting, I was reading a recent blog by Andres Tapia addressing, the recent backlash against DEI and the fall of affirmative action. And he said that, this is a period of challenge, and it also presents an opportunity for the field to evolve beyond its current state to a more fulfilling and far-reaching ideal. So what he suggests is that we must return to our strategic initiatives and ensure that they uphold 3 tenets. Number 1, he says, DEI strategic initiatives must directly show how they align with the enterprise's core priorities, such as innovation, growth, talent, optimization, sustainability, while addressing any unique organizational needs. The second one is DEI strategies must address both structural and behavioral inclusion, the systemic piece, right, to ensure all talent reaches their potential. Currently, impactful approaches to enable all individuals to excel remain largely unchanged from his perspective. And finally, number 3, he says, DEI strategic initiatives must view and leverage each diverse member and team as critical instruments of change within one's organization. So change agents, everyone should be considered a change agent within organizations. And to do so, we must motivate middle management, right? That we know, based on research, generally shows the most resistance to DEI efforts within organizations. In another report that I read by McKinsey, they noted that companies fulfilling their internal DEI commitments take a more systematic approach also, right, to establishing their D&I strategies, and that they use 5 critical steps for setting and achieving successful D&I strategies. And this is kind of aligns also with what Tapia says. And number 1 is aspire. I really like that. It's aligning on the vision, right? These companies set a bold but achievable DEI aspiration. So there's an aspiration here that is linked to the company's overall mission and the strategy. Then you want to assess, you want to build that fact base. These companies use both quantitative and qualitative analytics to establish a baseline and determine what DEI interventions are most needed for the organization. The third one is architect. You should develop a plan, right? These companies develop a plan for which DEI-related initiatives will be rolled out, when they will be rolled out, based on the company's overarching strategic objectives. Number 4 is act. We need to mobilize capabilities and resources. Extremely important. These organizations mobilize the resources, capability building required to deliver on DEI initiatives. And finally, advance, right? We need to advance, measure progress to scale and sustain the momentum of your DEI initiatives. So, really organizations must focus on research and innovation. That's another way that we can continue to build on DEI strategies. Stay updated on the best practices and the emerging trends in diversity, equity, and inclusion, encouraging innovation and experimentation. One emerging trend that we see, of course, is the intersection of DEI and ESG. As you know, ESG, environmental, social, and governance, it's a framework used to assess an organization's overall impact, right, on the environment and society, as well as how it governs itself internally. And ESG is a holistic approach to evaluating the sustainable and the ethical practices of a company. And DEI is fundamental to a comprehensive ESG approach. Organizations committed to DEI are more invested in employee and stakeholder well-being. We know that. They're also better equipped to address social issues and implements very strong environmental and governance strategies. So organizations that prioritize ESG and DEI practices are often more attractive to both employees and customers. So when a company demonstrates a commitment to environmental sustainability, to social responsibility, good governance, it not only helps the planet and society, but also builds trust and reputation. So that's one important aspect in terms of what can we do to recommit to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Great points. I welcome comments from Jason and John on this topic about specific strategies for overcoming resistance to DEI.
Really appreciating all of what you shared, Cecilia. And I heard this sort of implicitly in your framing, which is that organizations need to refocus their language and their narrative around culture, climate, and organizational health. Right? That's what we're talking about. We're trying to ensure that there's cultural health, that there's health in the climate of the institution, and that there's organizational health. And that means that in some ways, DEI-related work is about risk management, right? It is about addressing vulnerabilities to organizational health. And of course, we care about the financial health of the institution. Why should we not care about the cultural health of the institution as well? And I think yoking those two things together is critically important. I often say to people, most institutions, even when they are emerging as a startup, have someone responsible for finances, right? I mean, most institutions, one of the first positions, it's like, you got to have some kind of finance manager, finance director, or, maybe a chief financial officer, right? Because that person's job is not only to oversee the day-to-day finances of the institution, but to be thinking about the financial health of the institution, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term, right? In the very same way, we need to have individual folks, teams that are oriented around the culture and climate of the institution. That's critical, right? Yes, of course, every department head has their own budget, and yet that does not become an excuse not to have a chief financial officer, right? In the same way, all of us are responsible for culture and climate in some way, and yet we still need a point person or a point team who's responsible for helping to steward the cultural life of an institution. And the last thing I want to say on that front is that I really think that work at that leadership level is critical. What do we mean by good leadership? There's a lot of conversations happening in the world about leadership. I think we need to reclaim that term leadership and think about the ways in which what it means to be a good leader is to be an empathic leader. What it means to be a good leader is a leader who cares about culture and climate. We've all heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so we need individuals who are leaders, right? Who are thinking of their leadership as being deeply connected to being stewards of the cultural life of an institution. That is leadership. And in my view, if you are not practicing leadership in that frame, then you're not a particularly rigorous leader after all.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add a ton in terms of strategies in this space because these two are far better equipped to help with that than me, but I can give you a little perspective. I came of age as an attorney during the Me Too movement. And frankly, from a lawyer's perspective, it was easier than this movement is because I was able to look my peers in the eye and say, tough. This is how it was supposed to be all along, and this is how it needs to be going forward. I will admit that as someone who considers themselves an ally, I struggle more with this movement because it seems like so much effort is put into catering to people that look like me, that are already too privileged, and shouldn't have to be convinced, shouldn't have to be felt better about themselves in doing this. They should just realize that it has to be done, and it should have been done long ago. And so there are those segments of the community that have to be dealt with as well. But I just want to say I appreciate some of these efforts because my brain, my lawyer logic brain, short circuits in some of these situations and saying, why do we have to accommodate these feelings of being persecuted or blamed for societal racism? Hey, you started at the 90-yard line of a 100-yard dash. You don't get to claim equality at this point. So it's, if anything, it's interesting to compare the two movements from the perspective of those that were privileged at the start of them and still are, because this one's a lot more multidimensional. And Jason, as you point out, hits people at more core level. You encounter resistance of more types and at a more visceral level than I think you did even with the Me Too movement. And that creates additional challenges that have to be incorporated.
Thanks, John. I think what I'd like to add to this is to emphasize and agree that leadership is core, especially I think whether I see champions of diversity or those who are just doing DEI for the sake of doing it. At this point in time, it's really important for leadership at the highest level and all levels to really be committed to DEI, and whether that is making the business case and then training or having conversations with them about how their enterprise, their organization is enhanced because of these values and principles around human dignity and the well-being of all people, including how they are perceived externally and their obligations to their external stakeholders. DEI is not just about your internal obligations to your team, but also how you act in the world, what your footprint is, environmental and social. I think that's really crucial, and it's an important time to think about that and not think simply about DEI as the ground up, the employees who are entering the organization, because at this point we need both levels. So I want to underscore that importance. The second point I'd like to make is this point that Cecilia raised about ESG, because increasingly, at least in companies and corporations, we are seeing DEI being folded or being required to work with ESG. And that, I think, is a very fruitful enterprise because DEI impacts all pillars. Environment, when you think about environmental justice and what we're doing in the world, on the S part, social, it's not, of course, a lot of our issues fall within that, but governance, how are boards comprised? What are the responsibilities around cultural diversity at the board level and overall diversity? Because boards and leaders drive organizations, entities, and companies. Let's not make any mistakes about that. And although there is, of course, some pushback around ESG, the truth is that we also have regulations both in Europe and in the United States that actually mandate diversity. For example, the NASDAQ mandates that you reveal the demographic characteristics of your board. It just recently survived a legal challenge. That's good for us in our field, right? So we have another set of allies that we can use and cooperate with for our agenda. And third, it's something that you brought up, Jason, about risk management. I see that it can be a double-edged sword, because risk management can be used to reframe diversity as a complete risk and say, oh, all we need to do is mitigate, just do the basics. And often risk management employs, it involves lawyers focused on compliance and trying to mitigate risk. And so if you say, for example, the Supreme Court decision opens us up to, consider, and we should be nervous about race-conscious decisions, the risk perspective is, okay, well, let's not take race into account and let's avoid that. So I think it's something that we need to keep in mind, doesn't always work in our favor.
Can I take back on that a little bit, Anka? And that's that it depends on what your risk management program looks like. The more modern school of risk management is enterprise risk management, which really considers, risk is not bad inherently. And there's an inherent risk in not doing things, in underutilizing your resources and your capital. So, as I said earlier, there's a risk to not doing DEI and any type of social responsibility work. It can be mission related, financial related, workforce related. So I would say having those discussions with your risk management and your attorneys actually is good, and view them as someone that can help you form strategies that advance while taking into account risk instead of labeling as just bad or good.
I think that's a good point, and I think our DEI colleagues and sectors, and increasingly, we're reaching out and people are coming to us who are not DEI practitioners but want to become fluent in this. And I think it's really important for that education to happen at the same time for our DEI, people who are dealing with DEI issues to be learning about the language of risk management, right? And how to talk about it in a way that advances our issues. And not, stop us from doing this. We are actually wonderfully on time, because this is the time now that we would like to open the floor up for questions. I see many questions in the in our Q&A box there, and we're going to start taking some of those questions. Kelsey, can you help us identify those, please? Or Angele?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. Thank you all so much. It's already been an incredible discussion. We're seeing so many comments. We have such an engaged chat box today. And I want to share, because I keep getting a lot of questions there in the Q&A box. A lot of resources have been shared from both our panelists and from some of our attendees there in the chat box. I will be creating a summary doc post-event to share out those resources. So no need to worry about trying to save or copy the chat. I know I've gotten a few notes about that. Okay, jumping into our Q&A. Our first question up: promotions at senior levels are usually being appointed based on relationships. Of course, there are racial, gender, or other factors that play into those relationship-based promotions and the implications of those relationship-based promotions. How do we call this out in the corporate environment?
Anyone on the panel want to take that on, or should I? I mean, just based on that question, it seems to me that when it's relationship based, I'm not sure if we're saying that there's a lack of process and people are just appointed based on relationships. Well, obviously, I think we all know that this is a non-inclusive process. There's no process. So the question is, what kind of conversations can you have with those individuals to get them to understand the importance of process and an inclusive process and the messaging that's sent when appointments are made and people are selected for promotions based purely on relationships, because obviously in an unequal playing field, those relationships will tend to favor those who are closest to centers of power, right? So I think the more specifics of that will depend, because how do you have that kind of difficult conversation, right? With somebody who might be your boss or your boss's boss, and raise the issue of inclusive process. And maybe this is where people turn to best practice. What is the best practice, and where we at the National Diversity Council can help around what is the best process for recruitment. And it's always process and an inclusive process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would just offer, a 3-step frame for giving that feedback. I think the first step is to, in the conversation with that leader, is to evoke a sense of shared goals. That would sound something like, I just want to say that I know we both value inclusion and transparency. And then the second step is to remind them perhaps of a previous moment where they actually did embody that. I remember last year I had a conversation with you. I heard you speak in a town hall where you said some things that clearly evidenced your commitment to inclusion and transparency. And then the third step would be provide the constructive feedback. And it's precisely for that reason that I'm raising this with you now, because I don't think this process is actually inclusive and transparent. And here's the impact on the community. So I'm wondering, if it's possible for us to support in creating a transparent and inclusive practice.
Thank you so much, Jason and Anika. Okay, we'll move on to our next question. What can we learn from the LGBTQ+ community that has been quite successful at promoting their agenda in recent years?
I definitely think that with the LGBT community, we should look and learn about how they leverage intersectionality. I mean, if we think about it, LGBT community is one of the most intersectional communities when it comes to DEI identities and social groups. And they have been able to really go deep into what intersectionality means, to really come together as a community and advance their cause, and in the workplace as well, the issues when it comes to LGBTQ topics in the workplace. So I think that we should learn about intersectionality from this community and how we can incorporate it in different areas. If we think about it, for instance, when it comes to different identity groups, you think about Latinx, Hispanic, Latino communities, we are very diverse, and oftentimes we really don't have a lot of shared values because of that. We have different immigrant experiences. So having that understanding of intersectionality within communities, I think, gives them more power, right, to be able to address concerns that they have in the workplace and in communities, and advance DEI for all, and also create allyship and influence others in organizations.
Great feedback, Cecilia. And to that point on intersectionality, how do you address backlash on the other side of the coin to the expanding and reframing of DE&I as intersectionality? We're seeing some backlash that this is whitewashing DEI work. Jason, you made some excellent points around this area, and I do think it's the right approach. However, I'm seeing this type of pushback.
Really, really appreciating this question. And I think my view is that we continue to talk about those aspirationally included people in our communities who are experiencing suffering, right? Who are not experiencing the fullness of flourishing and thriving. We have to talk about that. My view is that we have to talk about that in the context of yoking it to the universal goal, right? So we should not take an approach that sanitizes and doesn't talk about race, doesn't mention Black and brown people or LGBTQ plus people or some otherwise aspiration included people who are not experiencing full inclusion in the moment. We should not take an approach that doesn't name that, but we have to name that in the context always of circling back to the universal goal. The human brain is complex, and yet people are remarkably simple. So if we don't reframe it for them and constantly yoke it to that fuller, more expansive narrative, then I think it lands us into some troubling waters. I think that we want to make sure we are keeping the focus again on the universal goal and also the specific places where that goal is not being met. That's the frame that I think can be helpful.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I have a follow-up question for you, but first I want to hear from Cecilia.
Yes, I wanted to add, thank you for that, Jason. I also wanted to add in terms of intersectionality, we need to also understand why intersectionality matters to your organization. And there's evidence, we have statistics that show that it matters. There's one thing that, is referred to as emotional tasks. And that is the experience of, being different from colleagues because of your inherent diversity and all of the associated negative effects, on health and well-being, the ability to thrive at work. Just to give you some statistics, 70% of people of color are on guard to protect against bias and unfair treatment within their work team, specifically because of their race or ethnicity. As many as 50% of employees have left the job because of DEI issues. To go a little bit further, 75% of LGBTQ employees have reported experiencing at least one negative interaction related to their LGBTQ identity at work. And just to end, 20% of employees do not feel included in their organizations and do not feel that they cannot contribute fully. So yes, intersectionality matters to your organization. Evidence shows with these numbers right here. So that's important, is to show, the facts, right, to your leadership and individuals that may resist it.
Definitely. Thank you, Cecilia. Anika.
I'd just like to underscore the importance of the universal intersectional approach, because we have so many constituencies for DEI, and having just come from a Disability Inclusion Summit, where physical disability, neural diversity really is a part of that lived experience that prevents people actually from being respected fully and coming to as full authentic selves to the workplace. So I don't think any of this is quote unquote whitewashing. I think it is living into that universal paradigm of human dignity, and that comes from a lived intersectional experience, because none of us are unidimensional. We are all multidimensional. And for example, when you talk about, and this has been happening a lot, the challenges of women of color, that is an intersectional approach. We are not in any way undermining that lived experience of people of color or BIPOC individuals, at the same time recognizing that a woman of color may have many more challenges than somebody else, and then when you take a more intersectional approach and add the disability component or the veteran component, it's a much more challenging landscape for that individual. And we want to make space, and we want to respect that person and have them be their full authentic selves in workplaces, right? That's the ultimate goal. So I think of this as living into that higher mission of ours.
I completely agree with you, Anika. Thank you so much, Anika, Jason, Cecilia, for that feedback. And I don't mean to put you all on the spot, but we have received so many questions in the Q&A box around intersectionality, around this one size fits all versus how to be inclusive, that I would venture to say that we need a whole webinar in the future on this very topic. So I would love, rather than to try to address all those questions, for us to consider maybe doing a follow-up on intersectionality and how that strategy can be inclusive and recognize, all the domains and dimensions of that diversity wheel. So I'm going to move along one quick question back to Jason around the term aspirationally included people. I've had some questions in the Q&A box around that, if you would speak a little bit more to that term, and then I have a question for John.
Sure, sure. I'm trying to be strategic and also playful with language. I'm so tired of the deficit framing of historically marginalized people, the underrepresented, the under-resourced, the oppressed folks. I just, want to frame the language a little bit more toward what the aspiration is, a little bit more around me as an agent in my own liberation, rather than just simply being subjected to other people's, behaviors and actions as though I'm some sort of, tabula rasa on which people get to project whatever they want. Instead, I want to feel sort of embodying this sense of agency. Now, I also want to just be honest and say that there's great research that suggests that when we, overly focus on the disparities and the deficits, it actually tends to demotivate people, right? And so, there's all this great research that we've been doing at Perception around what we often call goal framing. And the whole idea is if we can tell stories about examples where people are being included, where people are experiencing, liberation and flourishing and thriving within institutions, if we can actually begin to tell some of those stories, that can actually motivate people into believing that it's possible and it's achievable. If you don't actually believe it's achievable and possible, it has the paradoxical impact of demotivating you rather than incentivizing you. So language and narrative actually matter.
I love that. One of the terms we like to use internally here at the NDC is really trying to be intentional to use language that liberates. And I think especially with terms like minority, where that is no longer accurate demographically and it is used to disenfranchise, I think that's such an important approach. So thank you for sharing that. Cecilia.
Yes, I wanted to follow up with that, Jason. So have you coined this term, aspirational included people? You don't know? Okay.
There's no copyright on that, I'm just playing with language because I think that language shapes thought, and we need new language to be able to reconceptualize our reality.
So I wanted to follow up and ask you this: in this new framework that you're presenting, or is being presented in this context and in this term, I see it even more inclusive than the other terminology that we've used, right, traditionally. So are you also looking at that in terms of this term to make it broader and to include all people, not just quote unquote the underrepresented or the marginalized communities?
Really, really appreciate that question, Cecilia. In this moment, I'm specifically thinking about those people who are working and struggling day in and day out to, render the otherness that has been projected onto them as obsolete. So that's the stuff so that's what I'm really talking about. Those folks, I think, I do think we need a return of language like human. For example, I think we need to reclaim the category of the human. I think the category of the human, as we know, over a series of centuries, has been narrowly constructed and confined to actually mean the dominant group, right? And so I think we need to say, no, we're reclaiming the category of the human because that's who we are, right? So I have lots to say about that, but I will defer for another time.
Thank you so much, Anika.
I love the word human because I am a human rights lawyer. So to me, human rights is about all people and about the rights of all of us to be respected equally and to be recognized as equal. So it has tremendous resonance for me. And I think now socially, I'm hoping that it has that resonance so long as, because I think it's more out there from, we talked about women's rights being human rights. That was a very big theme for the Women's March. Human rights is the term that really resonates with the LGBTQI community too. And I think the human rights framework has also been used to, I know, advance civil rights and liberties too. I was actually in Atlanta at the Museum for Civil Rights and Human Rights, and it's amazing. So there is really a huge, I think a real important framing in terms of human well-being, dignity, and rights.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Anika. And I did want to again acknowledge I'm seeing more and more questions around intersectionality. And given the nods I got earlier, I'm going to be saving those questions for our next joint webinar. So my next question goes to John. John, thank you for your insights. Will you please add more context details or more details on DE&I and patient care in the healthcare context? And also, if anyone else wants to add, we know healthcare has unique concerns around cultural competencies in DE&I.
Sure. So health disparities exist across a wide array of demographics nowadays. It can be socioeconomic, it can be, and it's important to call out that it's often racial or ethnicity based. And we did a project at the beginning of the pandemic, a listening tour in different environments. And one of the largest pieces of feedback we got from that was that doctors don't connect with patients. They don't seek to identify commonalities and to acknowledge differences in lived experiences and perspectives. And that limits the depth of the patient-physician relationship. And there is literature that shows that the strength of the patient-physician relationship directly impacts health outcomes. And so what we did is we created a program called the First 5 Minutes. It's on our website, you can Google it. And it really helps physicians, but I wouldn't say it's unique to physicians. It could be clinicians. Frankly, it could be anybody that has a client type relationship. Work through implicit biases and find ways to acknowledge their lived experiences and the perspective they're coming from, and to be inclusive of their patients' lived experiences and where they're coming from in the first 5 minutes of the relationship. In so doing, you can start to build trust. Now it's called the First 5 Minutes. It doesn't end there, obviously. But I think this is one of the emerging areas of healthcare right now, is that one of the best ways to deal with health disparities among the many systemic barriers is relationship-based and with the clinicians. So that's been a focus of ours. But I think it's a pervasive one, not unique to healthcare, but certainly pervasive in it.
Thank you so much, John. Would anyone else like to add anything to that question? All right. Well, I know we're coming up on the end of our time together, so I wanted to take this opportunity. We've gotten a lot of requests in the chat and the Q&A box for any recommendations you have around content, whether it's books, podcasts, documentaries, any particular thought leaders that you like to follow or reference. So I want to take one quick minute with each of you to hear if you have any resources that you'd like to suggest. Cecilia, I'm going to put you on the spot up first. Cecilia, any resources or content that you'd like to leave our audience with? And again, I'll be including this in a post-event survey for attendees.
I was thinking of our NDC toolkit, but it's only for our partners and NDC CDPs or graduates of the NDC certification program. But there is a section of the NDC toolkit, and Kelsey, maybe we can share the link in the chat. There's a section of the NDC toolkit that is open to the public, where we have infographics that are all about diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. Some of those infographics are created in-house at the National Diversity Council, so they touch on any of the quote-unquote diversity segments, and you can download them, you can share them. So that's only one page that is open to the public and the NDC toolkit. So I'd like to share that with everyone.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And if anyone attending today has questions about the toolkit or any of our partner resources, please feel free to email me at kelsey.hott@nationaldiversitycouncil.org. We'd love to engage you as a partner. I saw a question about measurement tools. We also have diversity scorecard templates and a range of templates and resources there. Jason, any content you'd like to share?
Well, would love to just drop into the chat a link to a book that I absolutely love. It's called Leading with Dignity by Donna Hicks, and it's been a fantastic, fantastic book that's really helped me to reframe, how I think about this work. And I'm also sort of selfishly going to drop into the chat a link to an article that I've written on using restorative justice to address racial conflict. So I'll drop that into the chat as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll make sure to include both of those resources on our follow-up document. John.
If you're trying to track some of the myriad of anti-DEI legislation out there, the Chronicles of Higher Education has a tracking tool that's helpful in that regard. I wish there was a similar one for all these different lawsuit challenges. I will say that Tatiana Murray and Riddhi Sethi, two authors with Bloomberg Law, have done some phenomenal work in this area, and they're who I go to try to keep abreast. So if you're trying to see some of the legal landscape, there's two potential resources.
Thank you so much, John. And that reminded me, we actually held a webinar about 2 months ago around the legal implications of recent DE&I legislation. So I'm sharing the recording of that webinar in the chat box. I'd like to thank Ford Harrison, our partner for that webinar. They have also agreed to partner with us next year to give a quarterly update on the legal ramifications around DE&I. So grateful to them. I've included that link there in the chat. So thank you so much, John. Appreciate that. And Nika, any resources that you'd like to share before you close us out?
I think that Cecilia's done a good job, and Jason, so I don't have anything new to add.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I'll pass it off to Anika to close us out today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's been an incredible discussion.
Well, I want to echo that thanks. Thank you so much, Jason, John, Cecilia. I believe in naming names. Thank you so much for enriching us with this discussion. And we hope that you will join us again for obviously, more discussion on these topics. You can see the wonderful feedback we've gotten. I want to thank Perception Strategies for partnering with us to host this national webinar. We look forward to so many more. And we want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. The numbers have been astonishing, actually. And we're so thrilled that you've stuck it out with us, even though we are 4 minutes beyond time. Thank you. Please join us for our next webinar in December on DEI and higher education, and we will continue this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Have a good Friday. Thanks.